Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms where I give you a heads up about upcoming shows and which date and time they will be aired. If you go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com, you can find links to the shows, MP3 files which you can download, or links to your favorite platform like iTunes, Spreaker, SoundCloud, and all other major sources. You can find information for upcoming and past talk show appearances as well as new book projects at MarlenePardo.com. You can also purchase books and merchandise there. And you can visit my author page on Amazon at Marlene Pardo Pellicer. Due to popular demand, I'm narrating my True Believer stories that I've collected throughout the years in a new series called Supernatural Storytime. You can find links at supernaturalstorytime.com. If you are into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate some of those at Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If you would like to read noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird, you can visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at MiamiGhostChronicles.com. I do want to thank you all for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. How is everybody doing today? Good, I hope. I'm doing very well. Things are good here. I know everybody always asks me about my farm, my chickens, all the things that I'm growing. Yes, everything is good here. We're getting a lot of rain. Even though I know you guys might not see this today, but out in the Gulf of Mexico, we have like a storm that might be Barry, but bottom line, it's drenching New Orleans. And as you know, New Orleans is unfortunately, because they're below sea level, this is a big problem for them. But yeah, for those of you who are familiar at all with Florida and South Florida weather, you know that this is hurricane season for us. So even though I'm really happy that we get a lot of rain because of the stuff that I have growing out in the back, all these trees, at the same time, these are the months that we keep our fingers crossed, because 2018 we were very lucky, and I'm hoping that we're going to be just as lucky this year when it comes to hurricanes and storms, etc. But anyway, let me get down to the important stuff, which is who my guest is today. And I know you are going to be excited when I tell you who my guest is. Her name is Robin Strom-Mackey. Now, she has been researching and investigating the paranormal for the better part of a decade. During this time, she's written extensively about ghosts on her blog, The Shore, which can be found at delawareparanormal.blogspot.com. She's also the founder and director of Delaware Paranormal Research Group. She's a medical professional, a mother, and a wife. Formerly, she was taught English, communications, and broadcasting, and she was a TV journalist for the U.S. Navy. So, let us welcome Robin. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm good. How are you doing?
Fantastic, fantastic. It is great to have you on. And I am going to ask you, all my guests get the same question, and my audience knows that. How did you get interested in the paranormal? I mean, was it a childhood experience? Was it something you developed later in life? What happened?
Well, I've always been, even as a child, I was always interested in anything to do with ghosts. I had a favorite girlfriend, and we would get together, and her older sister would tell us ghost stories until we were so scared that we couldn't go to bed at night. Yeah. I always loved the movies, The Shining and The Fog, if anyone remembers that one. Yeah, I mean, it dates me, but, so it was always an interest. But I never actually had a paranormal experience until I was much older, actually.
Really? Okay.
In my 30s, yeah.
What happened?
Well, my husband and I bought an old house in Pennsylvania, upstate Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And the first night we're moving in, actually, was the first encounter that I had ever had. We were cleaning the house, and we had a very young son at the time. He was about 2 when we moved in. So we put him down at his regular time because he crashed out. He tended to crash out pretty early. So we put him down in a bedroom that we had on the first floor, in a nest of blankets and pillowcases and, all that kind of stuff. And he went sound asleep. And my husband and I continued cleaning the house and unpacking boxes and moving things around until we were so exhausted ourselves. At about midnight, we rolled out our sleeping bags and we lay down and we went to sleep mercifully. Very, very deep sleep, because if you've ever been through a move,
Oh, yes, God. Everybody doesn't realize the move is not the packing, that is the unpacking. So absolutely, I understand very well.
Oh, yeah, exhausting. So anyway, we're sound asleep. And somewhere in the middle of the night or early morning, I get awoken. I'm not quite sure how, but I woke up suddenly, and staring above me, crouched down on the floor looking over me, is a small child looking at me.
Wow.
And, it's very dim, and I don't, and I'm groggy, and, so I'm like, what are you doing? So I assume it's my son.
Right.
And I said, what are you doing out of bed? And, why are you up wandering this very foreign house at Lord only knows what time. And the child proceeds to get up and, moves down the hall, skips down the hall and kind of disappears into the night. And I can't hear him, which is a really bad sign with a 2-year-old, because anytime you can't hear him,
yes,
they're into something they shouldn't
it's too
be.
quiet, yes.
Right. So I'm calling him by name. I'm like, what are you doing? Where'd you go? What are you doing, honey? Oh, and I don't hear anything, and I continue not to hear anything. And I'm like, what's going on? So I get up, and I go down the hall to the first story bedroom that I had put him down in, and of course he's sound asleep in that nest of blankets and pillows that I had put him in. Mm-hmm. So at that time I was, I wasn't thinking paranormal, because I never had an experience to do with the paranormal at that time, but I knew it was shockingly odd. He, for one, has always been a very sound sleeper. You put him to bed and he's out, for 10, 12 hours usually. So,
right.
But after that, we continued to have occasional odd experiences. For one thing, I was teaching at the time, and I woke one morning. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and my son was usually a very early riser. He'd always been. So I hear playing outside my bedroom doorway in the hallway, and I said, honey, it's way too early. I don't want to get up now. You need to go back to bed, get a couple more hours of sleep, because I'm not going to be up, at 5 o'clock in the morning to be watching you. And the sounds of playing continue, and they continue, and I'm calling out to him, you need to go to bed, honey. You need to go to bed. And the sounds of playing continue, and so I go out into the hallway, and of course there's no child out in the hallway playing. And I go into his bedroom, which is across the hall from mine, and of course he's sound asleep again in his bed. So I'm thinking, what is going on?
Yeah.
And apparently my mother, who is not into the paranormal, she came to visit us for a week, and it was one of those old Victorians that had the front staircase and the back staircase for the servants.
Yes.
So she hears the sounds of playing on the back staircase, which are steep, and he's small. And so she's worried about it. She hears these sounds of playing, a child playing on the back staircase, and she's worried that he's going to fall down the stairs and break his neck, of course. So she goes down out to the back staircase, and of course there's no child playing on the back staircase. And she didn't tell me about it. Because
it's like,
my mother is patently not into the paranormal.
Right. In other words, I think she was probably thinking, this conversation is going to go in a direction I don't want it to go. It's true. It's
I don't want it to. Exactly. Yeah. So she didn't tell me about it until about 2 years later, when I think I was saying, I think my house was haunted. And she's like, yeah, I think it was.
And you're like, what?
Why didn't you tell me?
Isn't it funny, especially when it comes from somebody like that it's like, okay, if you're saying that.
Right. A patent skeptic is someone to believe, actually, you know.
Yeah. Yes.
So, and you know, very often his toys, his electronic toys would go off in his bedroom. I mean, that happened a lot. He wouldn't be in the bedroom, and there was one race car toy in particular that would just rev up suddenly and start going off, and I'd have to go up to his bedroom and turn it off. And I always, you know, I'm skeptical myself. I just assumed that the batteries were running low or the thing was, you know, malfunctioning.
Mm-hmm.
And I really didn't think anything of it at the time. I just turn it off, take the batteries out, you know, replace the batteries if necessary, and just go along with my day. But looking back on it now, I think that there was perhaps something going on.
Yeah, it's a lot of these things. It's only in hindsight when you start looking and you go, no, you know. But when it's happening, if you're busy and stuff, it's like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a brand new teaching career. I had a 2-year-old. I had house renovations going on, and I didn't have time.
Yeah, sorry, but I don't have time to figure this one out.
Yeah. So I just kind of brushed all these things off, and then, as I say, like you said, in hindsight, I was like, wow, you know, maybe there was really something going on there. I didn't have time for it at that time. So
sure, but at the same time, and I want to say, even though it sounds like a haunting, but it didn't sound malevolent, you know, it didn't sound, it was a little kid, you know, like more than anything mischievous, and it wasn't like nothing that you hear about in some hauntings where it's like, you just want to like race out of the house. It didn't sound like that what was going on.
No, absolutely not. It never felt that way. It was a child. It was most markedly a child, and it was doing what children do. It was playing and being mischievous and curious, if nothing else. So.
Did you ever see, what was it, like a little boy, or did you ever see him again after that first night?
No, I never saw him again after that first night. That was the only time I actually made a visual contact with him. But I believed it was a small boy because it played with my small son's toys, the car toys and all the things that little boys are interested in.
Right, exactly. And what happened? Did you guys move away, or did it fade away? What happened with what was going on there?
Well, my husband ended up getting another job, and it was down in the Delaware area. And so after only 2 years, we ended up selling the house and just moving away. So
wow.
So that was kind of the end of that. But that was my first experience with it. So.
But that's a really neat, because it was one of those things that, and it's almost like you said, even though it was an old house, you're in the middle of moving in, and the last thing you're looking for is to have a paranormal experience, much less see a little kid ghost. You know, I totally understand when you're saying here, I'm exhausted, I'm ready to pass out. Plus, I've got a bunch of other things, you know, to do. And
anyone that's been in the teaching career knows that your first year of teaching, you don't do anything but teach. Eat, breathe. Teaching, you're getting ready for classes, you're teaching, you're grading papers, and you don't have time.
No, of course
and then
not.
I have a 2-year-old on top of that. But it definitely lit a fire of interest in me, so that when we had, when my son got a little older and I got a little bit more secure in my career, and then I realized that you could actually research the paranormal, you know, all that thirst that I'd always had kind of reignited. And I said, you know what, this is what I want to do on the side. This is what I want to pursue. So, and it became kind of a lifelong pursuit.
Well, but you also had the advantage of having, in other words, but sometimes people are interested in, they read about other people's experiences, but they never really have what you even had, which was an actual visual of a ghost. You know, even though you didn't know it was one when you saw it, but it was like, even if nobody ever believes me, I know what I saw.
Right.
So what happened? You did you join a group? Did you form a group? Or did you just start to research about the paranormal?
Well, when I realized, and I have to account this to the Ghost Hunters television show.
Right,
I was cruising through the cable channels one day, and I came across one of the first episodes of the Ghost Hunters, and I'm like, it was one of those aha moments. I'm like, these guys are plumbers,
right,
and they research the paranormal. I'm like, I could do this too.
Yeah.
So, and I was hooked. So, and we actually are part of the TAPS family network now. We went ahead and applied and went through the vetting process. And so, I mean, it's a great honor to actually be part of that network.
Yes.
But so I mean, that was the moment for me. I was like, if plumbers can do that, I can do that too. So
I think that was really, believe it or not, initially, you're absolutely right. That was one of the appeals of that show, which of course was, it was that these were, how they did the presentation, the intro to the show, which plumbers by day, ordinary guys. And then they were doing the paranormal, which was very appealing, I think. Whoever thought of that was absolutely on the money with it.
Yeah, it was an epiphany. So
Yes.
Yeah, and that was my moment, and I found a group in my area.
Okay.
And I remember I filled out the application, and then I'd hover on the send button, and then I wouldn't send it. I'm thinking, do I really want to do this to my life? Because I knew. Yeah. I guess I knew at the time that it was a commitment, and I had to be fully in on that commitment. And then I would fill out the application again, and it wasn't a small application by any means. And I'd fill it all out again another night, and then I'd hover on the send button, and then I wouldn't send it. And then I'd do it another night, a week later, and I'd hover on the send button, and I wouldn't send it. Finally, one night I sent it.
You said, "Oh, well, okay, yeah, well."
Yeah.
And a lot of people sometimes now it's become more common because, like you said, back when the Ghost Hunters came out, they were like the first of these reality type TV shows having to do with paranormal, research and things because previous to that, there have been these shows, but it had never been from, first of all, that reality TV, you had In Search Of and all these other shows, but usually it was retelling of historical ghost stories.
Right, exactly.
This was a whole new take on it, and now it's become much more common. But people don't realize, and you were absolutely correct, that if you really, back then, if you got into that, you were making a commitment as far as giving up your time and things like that.
Oh, yes, definitely. I think a lot of people don't understand that even now, I have people applying for my group all the time, and they have no conception of what it actually takes. They think it takes 45 minutes like the television show.
Well, no, and that's why I tell everybody, I said, do you know how, because I've been doing it since the 90s, I tell everybody, I go, yeah, you get like you said, 45 minutes worth, and you go out, like I call them, some stuff that are just duds. Nothing happens. It's boring, but if you're expecting like a replay of what you see on TV, a lot of times it's boring, or you're disappointed, or it just doesn't manifest. I mean, a million things that it's not as exciting. Yeah, every once in a while you do come across an investigation that from the moment you get there, it's sometimes even before things are happening, but a lot of people that don't know any better are kind of disappointed, I think, when it doesn't live up to the expectations of what they see on TV.
Well, and a lot of times, too, they don't realize that the 45 minutes that they're watching television, it took them 3-4 nights to film that.
Yeah, or a week sometimes.
It down into 45 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, they do a lot of editing. what everybody sees. Yeah, you're right.
3 or 4 nights of absolute boredom, and 3 or 4 nights of pouring through endless hours of video and audio, and
Right. And like I tell them, these shows, they've got a production crew behind the scenes running around doing all the heavy lifting and, and setting anything up and, everything else. But That's not always the case when in reality, I've been on, because I was always a freelancer. I worked with a research foundation that did all of Florida, and I would usually do South Florida, or if they needed, like I say, a warm body in another place, and they would, get in touch with me and say, Marlene, are you willing to travel a little bit? Why? Because a lot of times, not all times depending, but if it was a residential investigation, it could only be done on a weekend, because this is the only time the family was able to have anybody come to their house. And that's another thing that will fizzle out potential investigators, is like, you mean I have to give up my weekend? Yeah, you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I know what you mean as far as expectations. Everybody doesn't realize the reality of the reality show, in other words.
Right.
So you went into it, which was great back then, because I think a lot of stuff has evolved even from those first, the beginning when Ghost Hunter came out. And so definitely you've been immersed in that. And how was your experience going in there, working in a team setting?
Well, it was fine. I lasted about maybe 2 years with the first team I worked with.
Okay.
And as you, I'm sure, are well aware, there's a lot of egos in this.
Oh, paradrama, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, and the first group I was in was the hierarchy was all male, and I felt a certain, downplaying of my abilities simply because I was female. So, they often overlooked me to for anything doing with the technical department, for example, which was ironic because I made my living in television and radio broadcasting.
Isn't that funny?
Oh, it was hilarious. Yeah, they'd put out emails and say, well, we're looking for new video equipment. Does anyone, we're going to call in Joe and Harry. And I'm like, well, I'm probably the foremost
right, but God,
in the group so I started to feel very overlooked, and if I did report something along the paranormal realm, they would often poo-poo my findings, and I started to feel very disenfranchised very quickly. So I ended up going out on my own, and for a few years, I went out, as you said, just like on my own, and I started writing. I started the blog about then. I started writing heavily and researching heavily in all sorts of different areas of the paranormal. And a lot of this is you're not just a paranormal researcher, but you're a researcher into science, and a researcher into psychology, and a researcher into sociology. You have to wear so many hats. There's so many different areas that you have to be facile in. And so I would research these areas, and I would write about them. I would do the occasional investigation, but then I realized that, I needed to start getting out there a little bit more and doing a little bit more investigating. So I basically formed my own group at that point and kind of, established myself in that way. So, and I've been going ever since. So
I'm glad you pointed this out, because a lot of people don't realize that if you're going to historical investigations, when I mean historical, I mean basically you're going to maybe a place that might have tours, but doesn't. In other words, you might speak maybe to docents or tour people, or that'll tell you about their experiences, but it's not the same as a residential investigation. Which, when you were talking about psychology, sociology, which you're actually trying to help somebody or getting information from somebody that's actually living in this house. It's totally different from going to investigate a location, whether it's a historical place, a park, a cemetery, whatever, where it's you're going maybe by a lot of sometimes urban myths, like I said, or people that work there or they're doing, but it's different. There's something that happens, I think, to people when you live in a place that's got some type of phenomena going on. Because let's face it, this is where you live.
Right.
And sometimes you do come across, and I don't know if you've had this experience, investigations where, you're more, sometimes there's concern about, how good a grasp on reality the people or a person living there has when they describe what they're experiencing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by this I'm not saying because, sometimes people who are really having genuine experiences, people overlook them or dismiss them because maybe they think, they're not wound too tight. You could be a little bit cuckoo. That doesn't mean you're not experiencing stuff. But still, you have to look at that aspect. If there's any type of drug use, all these other things. But people don't realize it's a little bit more complex depending on what type of investigation as far as the hats that you wear. If you're really, truly invested in doing a good investigation versus sensationalism, if you know what I mean, which is like...
I absolutely know.
Right. All I'm looking for is my great, oh my God, this is going to go viral, or this is great, and you really don't do the research, or you don't care how or what really is, was that really supernatural phenomena, or was just that something that looked great on maybe on a video or a photograph, but could be easily explained. And, I'm sure you've come across that. So, and it's funny because I've that thing that you said about deciding to start your own group, I've heard that from so many paranormal investigators, of which have been doing it for a while. In other words, that they're committed to it, that they get to the point where they're like, you know what, I gotta do my own thing and just bring in where I set the rules, and then I bring in a team and I put a team together. For various reasons, some of them very much to what you described, especially if you're a woman, if you're female. Yeah. So what kind of investigations were you doing? Were you doing residential, or were you going to historical locations? What were you investigating?
Basically, with both teams, we've done kind of a combination of residential and historic locations. We don't do. I do make a distinction, and I think you kind of made it yourself, that there's paratourism and then there's paranormal investigations, and I have always made a distinction between this is not pure entertainment. This is an investigation. So, and I've always done paranormal investigations. We don't do paratourism. We don't do ghost walks, and if we do, we have on occasion, done some money making things. But I make the distinction even then. I'm like, this is for entertainment. This is not to forward paranormal research. So if you do have a good time, if you do, think you've experienced something, that's great, because you paid the price of admission. But
exactly.
This is not advancing the field, and I don't consider it to being so. But
right. If you happen to catch a great photograph, good for you. But
right, right. But so we do. I try to do very circumspect investigations. We keep the amount of people at an investigation to a bare minimum. We try to contain any evidence that we might gain. We keep the level of contamination down.
Right.
So we do. I do a very careful. I do very careful investigations. So I invest a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money into my investigations, and so I try to make them.
Yeah, sure.
As contamination free as possible. So, but we do. We have done. Haunted hotels. We did a haunted fort, but we've done a lot of residentials as well. I think we probably do mostly residentials, but
right, yeah. And that's another thing that you consider. It's when you just mentioned right there, contamination. If you're lucky enough, let's say, to gain access after hours to a location that's empty, your fear of contamination is different than maybe with a household where there's people living there, or if they have pets, or if they're, whether they stay behind or not during the investigation. It's just a different layer. Sometimes the area is smaller. So yeah, those are, a lot of people don't realize that those are things, is this house close to a railroad track, where, or a busy street where you've got sound of traffic or lights, coming in through windows, reflections, all those things people don't realize have to be thought about.
All those things there. Yeah.
Or, you don't get all excited about nothing. After it gets debunked when you realize there wasn't anything really there. And have you come across any investigation? Let me ask you something. What happened? You wrote a book called The Anatomy of a Ghost. Does this have to do as far as what you found throughout your investigations, as far as what it is exactly, what a ghost is, or what is that book about?
Well, Anatomy of a Ghost was basically a research book that I did about all the different theories out there about what ghosts are and what the paranormal might pertain to. So I delved quite a bit into the lore, the ancient lore of ghosts. So I talk about, for example, the Egyptians' ideas about what ghosts were and the soul, and I talk about the spiritualist movement quite a bit, because I think it all kind of began there with the spiritualist movement and the parapsychologists. Then I talk about the more modern theories of what the paranormal is and what actually ghosts are conceived to be, and what poltergeists are conceived to be. I talk about some man-made ghosts, the theories about like the Philip experiment, where they created basically a ghost out of their own minds.
Right, like a tulpa, yeah, exactly.
Well, and I talk about tulpas too.
Right.
But the Philip experiment was more about psychokinesis and proving that a group could manipulate psychokinesis to create a spirit of their own, basically.
Right.
And I also talk about other things like shadow people phenomena, after-death communications, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. So I kind of tried to do the whole gamut of the ghost experience in that book.
Right, because people, I mean, if you look, God, there's been fear of ghosts, let's call them ghosts, I mean, since ancient civilizations, and you go from the where people, you weren't even allowed to mention the deceased name, and every effort would be made to make sure that they left, and then there's like others that translate into ancestor worship.
Right.
But there's always a lot of fear. In other words, with all these different civilizations, that they had no crossover, no contamination, and they all had that fear of / respect of deceased human beings, the spirits, depending if they were restless. In other words, every effort was made to appease them and like have them move on, and make sure you didn't do anything to make them stay behind. And they were, it makes you, for those people that say, well, superstition. Personally, I think when you do the research, it's very strange that you have all these different cultures, countries, continents apart that have that one common denominator, which was fear of the dead, as in the spirit of the dead that chose to stay behind. In other words, they all thought it was a problem. And like I said, some cultures would forbid you even to talk, mention that person's name for fear of that this was going to keep that spirit, to linger around behind, and then you had a big problem on your hands. And even same thing, you know how sometimes we hear about, more modern times where you would hear, there was a tragedy or murder or suicide at his house, and it would get a reputation for being haunted.
Right.
And that was the same thing in all these different locations across the world, regardless of what the culture was, where, something bad happened at a house. It was it was like you don't want to move there, like bad. This was like
right.
like a cursed either house or place or anything like that. So when you see that, it's that I call it like a shared human experience, which is like, yeah, superstition maybe, but it's like, yeah, too many, that it seems too real. And for all these different peoples to kind of describe the same thing, which is, of course, the existence, of the human, I don't know if you want to call it the soul or the conscious awareness of that person after death, in other words. I know there's a lot of people that think, once you die, that's it. You go in the ground and your consciousness is gone. There's no more you. And also, when you mentioned that thing about the spiritualism, I think a lot of people don't realize that. I personally think that it also developed because there was a lot of wars, the Civil War, where a lot of people had lost loved ones, and I think there was a big desire to like reach out and have, kind of reconnect sometimes with a deceased, either father, son, brother.
Yeah, absolutely.
That maybe for some families never even knew what had happened to their loved one. They might have fallen in battle somewhere and they were never heard of, so they were just reported as dead or missing in action or things along those lines. And I tell everybody, because but around that time when you were mentioning that thing of spiritualism, that even a little bit, after that they were saying, that there was also a lot of frauds, as far as psychic mediums. Mm-hmm. And I tell everybody, what? I think the problem would come in. I'm not going to tell you there weren't people that were doing, fraud. That basically they were taking the advantage of people maybe that were heartbroken or wanted to. But I think that sometimes there were genuine mediums out there that, unfortunately, this is how they fed themselves and had a roof over their heads. And I think that when you had a parlor full of people that wanted to see manifestations, it's like, maybe you could do it, but not every single day, or or every week, or So they kind of fell back on doing basically tricks, for lack of a better word. But it doesn't mean that they were all totally frauds. It's just that they couldn't do it consistently. In other words, to keep the money coming in.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Let me ask you, when have you ever had did you ever go on any investigations that you felt like, because of what you encountered there, that you needed, it was either that you wanted to refer it out, or it was beyond the capabilities of the team, as far as maybe because it was a very dark haunting?
No, I haven't. So.
No, I'm curious, because some people, some people do, some people don't. Others I've heard that they haven't, but they always have they have either clergy or somebody they can refer it to if they say, what's going on here is like, this is not like your ordinary, I've got a dead person in the basement kind of deal. What's the strangest case that you've been involved in?
Well, we did have a case that I wrote about in my second book, actually, on the hunt for the haunted, which appeared to be a case where the homeowners were becoming temporarily possessed by the spirits. Okay. In particular, the homeowner's boyfriend was they were doing extensive renovations on the house, mm-hmm. and the former homeowner had been a rather unlikable person, to put it kindly. And he had been the original owner, builder of the house. And when he passed, I believe he passed in the house, mm-hmm. In a recliner that he had used extensively in the last couple of years of his life. He'd been in a wheelchair. Okay. He'd been a diabetic, so he was not getting around very well. His eyesight was dimming, and he had spent the last couple of years of his life pretty much totally alone. Okay. Because he wasn't a terribly likable person.
Right, yeah.
So the woman that purchased the property, purchased it on auction, and with all of the former contents of the home, the previous owner. So so she basically bought a rundown house with all of the former owner's possessions in it, including this recliner that I think I had already mentioned.
Yes.
So she was pretty much renovating the entire house. She added on rooms. She gutted other rooms, all the other rooms. Mm-hmm. And she had a boyfriend that lived next door, excuse me, with his father, actually. And he would come over and help her with the renovations. Well, he was starting to have these strange behavioral shifts where he would fly into these unaccountable rages.
Okay.
And he was at times being very belligerent, very aggressive towards her. He was also being very aggressive to his father, a man with whom he had a wonderful relationship. At one point, he punched his father out on the front porch and threw him off the front porch. Yeah. So, and a neighbor that had lived in the neighborhood for many years witnessed this when he attacked his father, and she told her husband at the time. She said, "That's just like Wilhelm had done. He sounds just like Wilhelm, who was the former owner." Yeah. So and he was also, as I say, being very aggressive towards his girlfriend, and twice he ended up chasing her out of her own home. She was trying to get away from him. She would go to her car and get in her car to try to get away from him, and he would jump up on the hood and start jumping up and down on the hood. And one time, the second time it happened, he said he came to, and he had no idea how or why he was up on her hood, jumping up and down. And I remember him saying, I kind of woke up and I was like, what am I thinking I'm going to get out of this? Because
right.
I'm pounding holes in her hood. So and he jumped down, and that was about the time he called us. Actually, okay. He's like, there's something really weird going on, and I need you to come over and help me with it right now. So.
Yeah, because he was physically aggressive. It wasn't just like a mean disposition. No. He was, wow.
Yeah, he was being physically aggressive, and it wasn't his personality. He was a very mild-mannered personality. So he had us in, and we did the walk around or the walk through, and he told us about all the different things that were going on, and he was telling me in particular about this recliner, and he said, this is the recliner that Wilhelm lived in for the last couple of years, and it's reported that he passed away in this recliner. He said, I sit down in this recliner, and he was a smoker. He said, and I immediately go to sleep, and I drop my cigarette, and we're looking at this recliner. It's got all these burn marks in the fabric. And he said, and I'm at this house, and my hips and my knees start to bother me. He was probably in his early 40s. I mean, too early for this kind of thing to go on. He said, and they hurt me and they ache all the time. He said, and then I noticed that my eyesight starts going out on me, and I can hardly see. And he said, but then I go back next door to my father's house where I live, and I feel fine. That I can't account for what's going on, and so. I kind of factored in all these things that were going on, and I said, well, how about we get rid of that recliner?
Yeah, let's start with that.
Yeah, let's start with that and see what happens with that. So he took the recliner out to the burning pit, and he basically burnt the recliner and in a big old bonfire. And at the time when he was burning the chair in the bonfire, he reported to me that he saw a man standing up in the fire and a small girl child.
Wow. And let me ask you something. How about her? Did she ever have, or was it just he was the target of whatever was going on? I mean, as far as the possession or whatever was going on.
Yeah, he tended to be the object of the aggressive possession, but she also was, and there was a small child spirit supposedly in the house as well. And he found her one day. She was actually an amputee. She had been amputated on one leg from the knee down.
Okay.
And so it was very difficult for her to get down on her knees. So when she was, doing renovations on the house, she tended to not get down on her knees. But he found her in the back bedroom one day on her knees, humming to herself, and all around her were these pictures, on that gray paper that you buy for kids, the cheap paper, were all these like watercolor paintings.
Okay.
That looked like they had been done by a small child. And I actually have pictures of these watercolor paintings. Wow. One of them was a rainbow. One of them was just streaks, like made with a brush. One of them had a few words written out on it. And so he walked into this back bedroom and he finds her, amidst all these drawings. And of course they didn't have children. She's an older woman. She has a granddaughter. That's who the art supplies have been bought for. Right. But the granddaughter actually lives in California. So there was no way that the granddaughter had done these paintings. So he kind of wakes her up and he's like, what are you doing? She's humming to herself. And he says, what are you doing? She goes, I don't know. I have no idea. So he picks her up. He helps her out of the room. She has no recollection of how she got there, who the paintings were by. So he goes back into the back bedroom and he goes over to a jar with paintbrushes, and he feels the paintbrushes and they're wet.
Oh.
So at the time, when I went, and she's a very level-headed woman. I love that kind of client. She's very level-headed. She's very skeptical. She's like, I'm not sure I believe in all this. And I said, do you have any recollection of how you got on your knees, where those paintings came from, why the brushes were wet? She says, no, I have no recollection of any of that. So,
wow.
So there was some definite suggestions that she was being, temporarily possessed. Yeah, by the child. So.
And what happened after they burnt the chair?
Well, he burnt the chair, and he also had a minister in from a local church.
Okay.
And after he did that, the aggressive type of manifestations, the aggressive type of haunting ceased.
Okay.
They were still experiencing the child spirit, and there was also a woman spirit in the house that was dressed in like 18th century clothing.
Okay. That
could not possibly have come from that house because that house was built in the 70s. So, the homeowner's boyfriend was seeing this woman almost daily. But after they burnt the chair and had the minister in, the aggressive type of manifestation ceased. And so they were just dealing with the little girl child and the woman that we investigated. So we did come in and do a full investigation. We did get some extremely interesting EVPs out of that evening. Probably the best EVPs that I've ever captured in the entire.
And what was the source?
History
the old man, or was it from the other two?
No, we got mainly EVPs from what sounds like a woman.
Okay.
They weren't childlike at all, and these two EVPs in particular sounded like a woman, repeating the same thing twice over. It was like a personal mantra. It starts out with very discernible but indecipherable whispering, and it's like, and then you get these very distinct words that said, I can't go out anymore. It's been 5 months, I believe it was, and then And the one says in Delaware, and the other one does not. So that was the only switch over between the two of them. But it was like she was explaining to us why she could not leave the house. You know, I can't go out anymore. It's been 5 months, or it's been 5 months in Delaware. So it was very, very odd.
Right.
But very unique. So, you know, and you usually get an EVP, it's 1 or 2 words, maybe 3 or 4,
Yeah.
but this was, you know, these were full sentences. So,
yeah,
very
and again,
interesting.
who knows what might have been there on that piece of land way before there was any type of development, or, I mean, that's,
Right.
you know, and sometimes...
Yeah, the development came in the early 70s,
Yeah.
but it could, I mean, it could easily have been farmland before that. So
Sure.
I always speculated it came in off, you know, a torn down old farmhouse, and she just simply migrated.
Yeah, people don't realize that sometimes you have structures and then they get old or demolished and then they'll stay empty land for years. In other words, people don't remember, you know, there's nobody around to ever say, oh yeah, there was an old farmhouse there, because, you know, as the city maybe expands or they develop it, nobody's out there to say, yeah, 50 years ago this used to be a farm. You know, sometimes, but a lot of times there's nobody around to point that out, and not everybody has the wherewithal or the desire, let's say, to go down to like a government office and look up a tract of land and see what was there once upon a time.
Right. Well, and sometimes the records get destroyed.
Oh,
you know, there's fires, and so
there was
that was very interesting.
Well, there was a case, and I've spoken about it in other shows, and I always draw it. It was down in Texas. And I remember now. It was called the Black Hope Cemetery, and it was something similar where a piece of land was used for, like, you know, like you could build like a custom home, like the developer would build a house for you, in other words.
Okay.
And this happened, like, I want to say late 80s or early 90s. And initially 8 houses were built, and they found, after one of the persons living there was digging for a swimming pool, they came across some coffins, you know, wooden coffins.
Oh dear.
Turns out that this piece of land where all of this had been developed on had been an African American cemetery. But, you know, as a matter of fact, the owners, they tried to go out. The developer didn't know, because this was like an unofficial graveyard. In other words, there was, even if you would have gone to county or city records, you know, that there was never any document that said that piece of land is being used as a cemetery, as a graveyard. What had happened was, like, maybe like around the turn of the century, there was like it was like a little town called Black Hope, and there had been a big fire, and, you know, I guess nobody decided to rebuild, but during the time that it had been occupied, they had been using that plot of land for burial purposes. And what happened was, of course, they weren't, you know, a lot of the people in that area really didn't have any money, so whatever markers they would put would be made of wood, which, of course, with time obliterates. So that's why nobody knew or remembered, or even if you looked on official records, did it show that once upon a time that there were people buried there.
Right.
So sometimes, people don't realize when you get those, like what you described, the ghost of this lady, which looks, by the way she was dressed, that she definitely predates the time of the development.
Right.
You know, really, what are her origins? You know, it could have been, or sometimes people had little, you know, what they call those little family graveyards that people would have near their homes.
Right.
Then, you know, like you said, everything's destroyed. The family moves away. You know, if they had markers, if they were made of wood, they basically just also fall apart, and nobody's none the wiser until you get something like that. And as far as the child, they had no idea, or was there any idea who the child might be?
No, there wasn't. He was a widower. He'd been married, but she'd had one child. This was another strange anomaly of the case. They had been married 25 years.
Right.
And she had a child listed, an adult child, male adult child, who was only 19 years old, but was not his son.
Okay.
So
right.
Try to figure that one out. So,
it's
and
like, okay.
In fact, the day that the wife, so the day that the wife passed away in the hospital, he came home from the hospital and kicked the adult son out. So we had no idea who the little girl was. And it was strange because when we were doing the investigations and the walkthrough, it was basically a house built on not a basement, but a crawl space underneath the crawl space. There was a crawl space underneath, and it was basically just like a sandy crawl space. It was just basically ground. Yeah. And so we looked in this crawl space, and there was evidence of clothing and a sleeping bag. So it had looked like someone had been camping out underneath the house, and we speculated that the adult son, once he got the boot, went and lived underneath the crawl space for a while. So it was it was a very, very odd situation.
Right. But, in other words, if that was the case, God knows, maybe this guy didn't have money. Like, okay, even though he was an adult, it was like, what can I do? I guess I'm going to have to sleep under the house. Yeah, which kind of ties in with what you were saying, that he was not such a nice guy.
No, he was a very not nice guy. So, and one of the residents actually was a retired police officer, and he had told the owner and her boyfriend that the late Wilhelm was reportedly a pedophile.
Ooh. Now that that puts a different twist on it.
Yes, that puts a totally different twist on it. So we did look into his police records. He didn't have any police record. That doesn't mean that he, perhaps he never got caught at it or never got arrested for that. But we, certainly worried that the little child might have been a victim. Yeah. So I don't know. I hate to think the worst of people, but
well, you know what? In the perfect world, everybody that does something wrong, criminal or otherwise, gets caught or brought to justice or gets their just desserts. Right. But there's a lot of people that do things. First of all, no one ever knows that they did it, so much less do they ever, go to jail or are even exposed. For all these, whether it's a criminal or a murderer, you know how they talk about these people that talk a lot because they're wanting to get caught, or these serial killers, that send stuff to the newspapers, or because they're like all narcissistic. I say there's a whole slew of those running around that have no desire to get caught. In other words, they don't send notes, they don't send letters, they don't taunt the police, and they die of old age in their bed. And I know it sounds very unfair when you think about it, but and of course nobody knows about them because they're very happy being anonymous. Coming to the point of what you were saying, if this was a circulated rumor about this guy, like you said, even if he wasn't arrested, that doesn't preclude that at some point he
by a former police officer, which obviously gives it more credibility. So,
sure. Yeah. And you know what? And sometimes I mean I don't know how big had he been a police officer in the force right there in that area where he lived at? For the city?
I don't know. I never got a chance to interview him, but I would assume because he'd been living in that area for a number of years. So.
Yeah, because I was going to say a lot of times cops, especially if they've been serving in that same area for a long time, they know everything about everybody, even if, in other words, they already know who does what.
Right.
Unofficially. they just know it. And yeah, that's a really interesting slant that God knows there's just no way to ever prove it one way or the other.
Right.
And Wilhelm probably took that secret, if there was one, to his grave and beyond.
and beyond, apparently. Yeah.
Yeah, people. But that thing of, it's really funny because when you were saying that thing about the easy chair, one time I got a story. I got somebody that communicated with me because throughout the years people send you like stories about stuff that they've had, experiences they've had, and I had one where they did. This was more recent. This was now a lot of people put those curbside pickups where they'll leave stuff like hey, first come, if you want it, take it, it's yours.
Sure.
And apparently this couple, this was over here like in Central Florida somewhere, and it was something similar where I guess an elderly guy, they didn't really know per se, but he had lived in this house, he had died, and the family didn't want it, and basically they took the furniture and put it out by the curb, like, take whatever you want. In other words, they were just emptying the house out. Small house.
Sure.
And this couple took exactly what you described, an easy chair and a little TV, like a small TV. They took it. They're like, oh, this is great. And that's when they started to experience phenomena. They would come home, they would find this TV on, which they had definitely... they would come on when they were asleep. It would switch out channels. Let's say they'd be watching it, they'd walk to the kitchen or something, and then they come back and the channel had switched. Like, what is going on? Same thing with the easy chair. That's not what I wanted to watch. Right. They started having like, if I think it was a husband, if he ever like, when you like, in those easy chairs, you kind of pass out, do like a little nap time. They both started to experience. He started having like really bad nightmares, and then eventually they both started having nightmares, even if they were, in their beds. And after a while, they kind of like, okay, did you just... and they were having nightmares where they were dreaming the same thing. Like, they would... how could we be having the same nightmare?
The same dream, yeah.
Right. And I believe, if I remember correctly, this guy, later on they found out that he had died apparently from lung cancer. And they would be, part of their dreams would be seeing like this old man with a lot of smoke and stuff. But at that time, they didn't know anything about this. So at some point, it took them a few months to kind of like realize, okay, when did this start? And they realized this started after we picked up these two items. Well, they got rid of them, but they went back to the location and they talked to a neighbor. And that's how they got this, backstory on who had lived there and what the story was. I mean, there was nothing about him being, but he apparently had lived alone. And he was, like an older person that lives alone. Like, they spend a lot of time sitting and watching TV. And apparently he had some type of lung cancer, COPD, something like that, where, that also, like, impaired him getting out. And, he kind of died, like, even, apparently he had family, but he kind of died alone, and, like, all they wanted to do was, like, get rid of all this stuff. They said, sure enough, as soon as they got rid of the TV and the chair, that was the end of it. No more phenomena, no more dreams, nothing. It was like a cautionary tale, if something looks, I say, because nowadays, it's not only when you go to flea markets or garage sales or even thrift shops. Sometimes you got to be a little bit careful with stuff. If it gives you the heebie-jeebies, pay attention to the feeling, because sometimes you might get, the attachment. In other words, it's not that you necessarily have to buy a house that's haunted for you to get some type of effect from, especially where something that was used a lot by that person. Like, in other words, they travel with it. Because this is where they spent all that time. And
they're attached to it in some way or another. Yeah. Yes.
And what happened eventually with this lady? Did she sell it? Did she stay there? Or what happened with that house?
She stayed. Eventually, the older woman departed. Okay. And one day they were on the couch, she and her boyfriend, and they were watching some television. And she said that the storm door opened all by itself and opened about as far as to let a body out, and then it closed and snapped shut, and they never had the child spirit again. But they did experience things on the outside of the house.
Really?
Which was interesting. Yeah, she had put in a master bedroom, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a one-story house, but she had put in cathedral ceilings in her master bedroom.
Okay.
So it was like 15 feet up in the air, and then they put windows in up at the top, where the roof is.
Right.
And they would find handprints up
Wow.
on these windows that were 15 feet in the air. So,
How does that work?
and they'd go and clean them off, and apparently they'd show up again. So they assumed that their inhabitants, their unseen inhabitants, had moved outside. So
It's possible.
yeah.
And you know what? It's really, because I have heard of the phenomena where they say some ghosts or souls are trapped by others that are there, and then when you get rid of one, then everybody else is able to leave. It's almost
Right.
like they hold them hostage. And,
Right.
like, okay, you got rid of the one that had everybody, basically roped in.
chained in.
Who knows what the story
Right.
was on that. There was one investigation I went on where the house had been built in the 50s, but the owners previous to the ones that were there occupying it, he had built like a large, I want to say like addition, and it was like a Florida room or family room, and he really nice paneled, and he had built like a loft, like with one of those spiral staircases that took you up to the loft. Really, very well done. The owner who had occupied the house, who had done that, he dropped dead one day of a heart attack in the house. And then the house had stood empty for a little bit because, the wife and everything. He kind of died, he wasn't that old, but very unexpectedly. But part of the phenomena they were having was really weird because it would only happen in that addition to the house. It's almost like, there was other stuff going on. Because of course, like everybody you think of, the usual suspect is going to be the guy that dropped dead of a heart attack in a house.
Right.
But sometimes you get other stuff going on that is not the usual source that you think of. But yeah, it's really funny how sometimes they're almost limited to, even though he had lived in the entire house, that owner, stuff that was tied to him because he had built that house and that loft. It was like his I want to say like a man cave kind of deal. Yeah. In other words, he had built it, even though his whole family lived in the house. It was like a man cave, and up in that loft, he had like, his computer and his desk and all that stuff. And a lot of the stuff that was the phenomena was that you would hear would be there. And that was really weird. In that investigation, they had some dogs, and they took the trouble. The owner's girlfriend, she took the dogs to some neighbors that lived like 2 or 3 miles away. Like, made sure, because we asked them, if you can. If you can't, it's okay. And the next door neighbors, they didn't have dogs, and the house that was right next to theirs, which was a corner house. In other words, this house was the second from the corner, was empty. It was totally empty, and they were on a lake. In other words, your source, and we were there like maybe a few hours, and all of a sudden, when I'm listening back to some of the audio and video, I'm distinctly hearing dogs barking like there, like when you have dogs living in the house. And I was like, wait a minute,
there were no dogs there.
There was no dogs there. There was no, and I know there were no dogs there, and I even had gone outside, and she had even. Because when we got there, she left for a few minutes to like take the dogs away till you drop them off. Miles away. There's no way sound could travel that much. And besides that phenomena, that was one of those weird things that just drops in that happens in the middle of investigations that you distinctly hear his dog barking. And I realized that when we were hearing it, we did hear it with our ears. But when you're caught up in something and you hear something that's very commonplace, like dogs barking, that you don't realize at that moment, why are we hearing dogs barking? There's no dogs here.
Yeah, interesting.
And later on, it was like, wait a minute, dogs barking? Wait, what dogs? They sometimes you'll have stuff that you'll hear, and you just it doesn't have to be, in other words, really weird. And it was like, so I'm saying, it wasn't like whispery or low. It was like more than one dog, as a matter of fact, barking.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, that was a weird investigation. But yeah, sometimes, I know that a lot of people say, well, talk about residual stuff, whether it's a smell or auditory or things like that, and another time. But that was a very convoluted case because of not only because of the phenomena, but because of stuff that was going on with the people that were occupying it, plus the next door neighbor of the house that was empty. It was very, very. It was it was one of those investigations that at the beginning seems very simple, I guess is what I'm talking, and then once you get into it, it just becomes more convoluted. And you're like, wow, this is a real mind bender as far as where the source of this could be coming from.
Right.
Which is when you have to do your research. So let me ask you something. Are you still actively? You still have the group working on investigations?
Yes, we still do investigations.
Okay.
We're not working on anything currently, but
okay.
Mostly because the book just came out, and we've been doing mostly promo for the book.
What's the name of? I'm sorry. This is not Anatomy of Ghosts. You said that you had written another one. What's the title of that one?
It's On the Hunt for the Haunted.
Okay, and that just came out.
That just came out in April.
Okay.
And it's a book basically about all many of our past investigations over the last 10 years and stuff.
Okay.
The Long Neck House that I was describing to you is in it. I also just talk about Fort Delaware, which is in Delaware City. There's a Hartley House investigation that we did 3 times. Actually, we investigated this house 3 times, which was and it always gave us a plethora of evidence. So yeah, it's a lot of our past investigations that were of the more interesting type. So. Do
you only work, what is it? Is it only do you cover only like the Delaware area, or do you go outside of that area if somebody calls you for
No, we definitely go outside. We're 15 minutes away from the Delaware-Maryland border, so we've done a lot of investigations in Maryland, and
okay.
I think I talk about my house in Pennsylvania as well, so basically all on the East Coast, but yeah.
I tell people I've had stories very, along the same lines that there's no resolution. In other words, you move in there, you have these experiences, and then like what happened with you? You moved away. You never find out who, what, how. It's just the experience in and of itself.
Right.
And then of course, and even you, like you said, you moved away so far. You never even find out. Hey, did anybody that moved in after me ever have the same experience? What came of that?
Right.
So yeah.
It would have been nice, to have talked to owners after us, but no, we never got the opportunity. So
yeah. People, I have people that will tell me, when they were kids or they were teenagers, like, yeah, we lived in this house and it was like terrifying, but then we moved away. In other words, they didn't have power over it, so their parents decided to move. That was it. That was the end of that.
Yeah.
So, anyway, Robin, I want to thank you so much for talking about your investigations, your experiences. Let me ask you, if somebody wanted to get the book, do they go directly to your website? Which, for my podcast listeners, what is your website?
Our website address is delawareparanormal.org.
Okay.
All lowercase. But it's also available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's available through Llewellyn Worldwide, who is my publisher.
Okay.
IndieBooks.org.
Okay.
Basically available on, at any of those venues.
Okay.
If they order it direct through our website, it will come postage free and signed by the author. So that's the one advantage of ordering it from us. But
absolutely, yes, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And are you going to be? Because I know you said sometimes you've done events. Or does your group do anything now for the Halloween season? Even though I know we're a couple of months out, but I know a lot of people now are preparing for what they're going to be doing for October, the Halloween season.
Yeah. Well, we're still kind of putting things together. I know I'm doing a book signing at the Greyhound bookstore in
Okay.
October.
Okay. I know it's like people. I know a lot of people are like, I tell everybody this is just like right after summer vacation, September. You walk into stores and you already got the autumn and the Halloween and even some Thanksgiving stuff up. I go for people that are gonna. This is people start planning stuff now, even now for what they're going to be doing into the fall season, and October is. Is the perfect time for, as far as any events or taking, either the tours or even the book signings, which your book sounds ideal for that. But again, thank you so much. I want to wish you the best of luck on any new projects and also with your group. And of course, I'll put a link to your website on the credits of the show. So if anybody wants to jump on over there and either get in touch with you, whether it's for the books or because they want to, contact you about any type of experience or an investigation, they can get a hold of you.
Absolutely.
All righty, darling. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good luck with your group as well. So.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right, guys. So, wasn't she an interesting lady? Let me tell you something. For all of you, because, when I've had so many guests that they, when I ask them that question, when was your first experience with the paranormal, and it's like a childhood thing. Look at her. Here she grows up. Yeah. Interested in the paranormal. Of course. Kids read, mystery stories. It's like, that little let's get scared and everything, but that's totally different. You have to understand that's like fantasy made up. You get scared a little bit and then that's it. Then here she's an adult, which I love that story. Absolutely love it. Here she is because I have a lot of empathy for what she was talking about, that you've just moved in, you have a baby, a toddler, a 2-year-old. All right. And the last thing you're thinking of is having a paranormal experience or seeing anything. When she's saying, we're basically moving in and go to sleep, fall asleep exhausted at midnight. I've been there, done that. And obviously, in other words, she's probably sleeping deeper, even though it was a different house, probably than she even normally would, because she's exhausted. She wakes up and she sees a little kid crouching over her, which, of course, she doesn't wig out because she's thinking, it's my little boy. Okay? Wow. So, see, she did have that. And like I say, obviously, she was there a very short time. When you think about it, 2 years flies, and it sounds like she was really busy. And then, she never really had a chance to investigate. In other words, if, little did she know that later on she was going to go and be part of a team and then create her own team to find out what was the history on the house, or if something had happened. And that thing where, her mom is hearing this child playing on the back stairs, which, yes, that was very common. These back stairs would be the ones that the servants would use. In other words, to go back up and down. This was in these older homes. This was very common, and that child, her mom, who's of course another skeptic, hears a child playing in the back stairs, assumes the same thing she did, that it's her grandson, only to find out there's nobody there. And of course, and this is the thing, when she's hearing what sounds like a child playing, it's distinct enough that she knows what it is, enough to the point that she's concerned. These are steep stairs and my grandchild's going to get hurt. He's going to fall or whatever. Again, she's not looking at a paranormal experience. I love that story. I love that story because when I hear those stories, again, it's very different from the person that's doing the ghost hunt or anything. They're looking, they're waiting, they're primed for having that aha moment. It's when you don't, when you're just like living life, what I call living life, that it kind of kabongs you on the head. Sometimes not so subtly, other times very subtly. And contrary to what most people believe, most people like try to explain it away by regular means. They don't think it's ghost, or they assume or something that they hear. They're not thinking, oh, that's the ghost on the back stairs, or, oh, it's the little kid ghost. No, you're thinking of, my child, my grandson, the pet, a million things. It's not only till you go look that you realize. And then her mom sits on the information for 2 years. Oh, and I've told this story before. I have an aunt, well, she's in her late 80s now. All the time I knew her, I still know her obviously, but very cut and dry. No superstition, no ghost, that's BS, blah, blah. Very, for lack of a better word, almost unimaginative if you want to go in that direction. None of this flight of fancy, and if people would ever talk about having any type of encounter with the paranormal, it was like, oh, they're over imaginative, that, or their imagination is running away with them, or they're lying, or anything but. And this just happened a few years ago. I cannot remember how the conversation started on that. And she talks about when she's a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. She's my mom's younger sister. And when they were in grade school, my grandmother was sending them to it was like a boarding school at a convent that was close by. And basically they were living there. And this was a very, very old compound, because it was like the school, the church, the convent. These are older buildings back then. They used to build them. Beautiful architecture, but very large. And as a matter of fact, because this was in Cuba, some of it dated back to the time of the Spaniards. I mean, we're talking hundreds of years. This is very old Gothic style architecture. So she says that, I remember, I've never forgotten it. She was telling the story how she's a little girl and she's sitting in her classroom, and all of a sudden she says she looks at the doorway of the classroom, and I'm thinking this must have been like, date-wise, I want to say it was maybe late 1930s when this occurred. Late 1930s, early 1940s. She looks at the entrance to the classroom and she sees a little altar boy standing there in the doorway of the classroom. And she says that all she could see was that he looked very sad, that he had a very sad look on his face. But even as a little girl, she's thinking, what is a little altar boy doing in the school? Like, in other words, remember, once upon a time, they would, in these Catholic, boarding school kind of, they were segregated. In other words, you didn't have co-ed classes. They would teach the girls, they would keep them apart. So to her, to see a little altar boy there, of course she's a kid, and he appeared solid enough that she mistook him for a real live boy. And she's thinking two things. One, why does he look so sad? Two, what is he doing here? Because he's an altar boy, plus he's not supposed to be here. All the little things, even as a kid, that go through your mind in seconds. She says she looks away, she looks back, and he's gone. In other words, she realizes there's no place for him to have gone. And I remember her, when she's talking about this story, I'm looking at her and I'm like, you knew that was, I mean, maybe not right that moment. You're a child. I think she was like 7 or 8 years old. But you realized later on, I'm sure, like a lot of people do when they look at childhood experiences, that they had a paranormal event or they saw a ghost. And you carry on sometimes, like people who talk about ghosts and seeing things that they're full of BS. And here you had one that definitely, there was no way for you to explain how you were seeing this little altar boy appear suddenly in the entrance to your classroom in this really super old building complex, and then you blink your eyes and basically disappears. So, and I've said this story before, for all the people running around talking about their paranormal experiences, some which are true, which are not, some people have experiences which they believe are true, but they never investigate, but the actual source is not really supernatural. But it's not that they're lying. They truly believe that what they experienced was for real paranormal. And they run out of the house, in other words, or they run away, or they whatever. They never go and say, what was it that made that noise, or whatever. There's a bunch of diehard skeptics, or the ones that profess no such thing as a paranormal or a ghost or blah, blah, blah. Which if they have these moments of honesty or a sympathetic audience, or at some point they realize, who cares, that they talk about maybe a bunch of experience or maybe just that one experience. Because at this point, I have never asked my aunt again, but it makes me wonder, has she ever had any other experiences that she just never talked about? Where, believe me, that some of these people take these almost like what her mom did, her mom took her 2 years, but talked about it. They just take it to the grave. They just never talk about it. Either one, because nobody ever asks them, or if I don't talk about it, it's not real, or I don't want to have a discussion about this. And I wouldn't be surprised if her mom, think about it. Her mom only confesses to this after she makes the remark about, I think my house is haunted. And her mom is like, who she's expecting is going to poo-poo the idea, is going to go, yeah, because I had this experience. It's almost like, I have to keep up my diehard skeptic reputation, especially with my daughter, who maybe I've dismissed anything having to do with the supernatural. And the only time I'm going to admit to having this experience was, well, she brought it up, so it's safe to talk about it. So a lot of people take stuff to their grave just because of course, and I'm sure everybody either knows, either as a friend or even a family member that's the diehard, where like, that's a bunch of BS, you guys are crazy, how can you believe that stuff? So nobody ever asks them, by the way, have you ever had that experience? So that's, stories untold. There's a lot of them out there, which brings me to the point of, if you're one of these who's had those experiences that you've never talked about, you can tell me. I would love to hear about it, and I will keep you anonymous. If you want to, if you don't, whatever, I'll get in touch with me, Marlene at MiamiGhostChronicles.com, or go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com, and there's a Submit Your Story tab. And you can either write it, I will interview you on Skype or on the phone or however you like. If you want to retell it yourself, if not, I'll retell. Well, however you want to do it. I would love to hear these stories, especially if it's something. Believe me, you're not going to say anything. I'm not going to hear anything that I'm going to go, oh, what is that? Believe me, I most probably have heard it all, and plus extra. So if you're looking for a sympathetic and understanding, receptive audience of one, that's me. So if you got a story like that, or a series of them, of experiences, maybe you've had more than one experience and you've just said, no, I'll just keep this information to myself, get in touch with me and let me know about it. And because I think there's a lot of you running around out there with all these stories buried inside of you that deserve to be told. So guys, again, thank you so much for being part of my audience. Take care. You're all wonderful. Come back next week. I've got a lot of fantastic, interesting guests. Also on the website, you can also find any of my appearances that I've done on other talk shows, on other paranormal talk shows, other interviews that I've done with different shows, different hosts, great hosts. You can either listen to it or even download the MP3 file. Just go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com. Take care and see you then.